On air. All right, I think we're here. I think it's working.
Yep.
So hi, Sirens, welcome. So I'm Nadia. We're starting a new video series on the angry therapist on this forum that is called UnSilencing You're Sexy. And the idea is to just cover like a variety of different topics that are raunchy, but fun, but really pertinent to women like us nowadays. And so the idea is to have some fun conversations with some pretty badass chicks that I've invited to come chill with me for a little while. And the first person I have here, I'm so excited because it's the first time we're actually talking officially, is Claire Griffin-Starrett. Who is not only an awesome human being and like an erotic dance advocate, which I'm a huge fan of, but you're also a writer, a dancer, a pole dancing instructor on and off, and you've spoken a lot about female sensuality over time, and I know that you've written on like numerous amounts of blogs and different pole dancing magazines, and you have your own blog, which I absolutely adore, thepolestory.com, which is also a book. And you are still the editor-in-chief of Vertical magazine, is that correct?
No, that I ended about a year ago.
Oh, okay. So she was the editor-in-chief of Vertical magazine, which is also a pole dancing magazine that's pretty awesome, and I totally love it.
I have a new project coming up in January, which can't be revealed yet, but it'll be along those same lines.
Fun. That sounds great. So the reason I've got her here, other than all these reasons already, is that she also wrote, she did her MA in somatic psychology, and her thesis, and this is going to be pretty awesome for all of you, is, hold on, I'm going to make sure I get it right, Embodiment of Female Sexuality Through Erotic Dance. So I'm excited to hang out with her, and I hope you guys are too. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming and visiting virtually.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I guess I really wanted to just start off this by asking a little bit about how you got, understanding how you got into this whole world of female sensuality and erotic dance, and what was your journey like from going from an interest of somatic psychology to specifically erotic dance?
That's a great question. I think I started them at the same time. So I started my master's in 2006, and at the exact same time I started my master's, I took my first erotic dance class, and it was taught by a woman who had been an exotic dancer in Vegas for 6 years. And she really used the movement as a way to explore sexuality. So we were journaling, we were talking, we were doing intense, movement exercises, two people together. And so, of course, as I started to do this, I was like, there's a real connection between what's happening in this classroom and what I'm learning about in school. So, and the first time I took the class, it was with I can't remember her name now, Tara Moore, sorry. The first time I took her class, I was like, oh, I'm fine. I do not need to be like comfortable, any more comfortable than I am with my sexuality. I am a feminist. I don't need to objectify myself, like all these things. Meanwhile, I was deeply uncomfortable, setting foot in a strip club. I was deeply uncomfortable with any sort of like display of it, like, and there were a number of things that I couldn't tolerate, but I just, went into the class thinking I would be really good at it, and that, what did I need to learn? And boy, was I wrong. Like within 15 minutes, I kind of just, it hit me like how much I was being asked to do, and how amazing the movement was, and how unskilled I was at it. And I was like, I have to learn this. Mm. So they really happened at the same time, and as I went on in my degree, it became clear to me that I wanted to explore the connection more, and I had a really cool advisor at the time who was the chair of the department who, not just had his PhD in clinical psychology from Harvard, but also had a PhD in sexology from a completely different university, and who basically said, this is great, and approved it. So it was lucky timing, too. So that's how I got into all of that.
Okay. And then you continued your journey in the erotic dance world.
Yes. Well, my first teacher, Tara Moore, I spent a year with her, and then she moved to Arizona, and then I went to S Factor. And I was at S Factor, I mean, gosh, probably I've been there for 5 or 6 years and taken time off here and there, but that was the second place that I went to. And in between, I kind of dropped into other studios. And I've never stopped doing it since 2006.
That's great. That's good. I didn't know that. I wasn't sure. I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear that answer. So I guess what I'd love for us to hone in on today, and I know we thought the topic for today's conversation is sex is power, which really can go in so many directions. We can talk about this forever. But I thought we'd start off by talking a little bit about, there's this one quote that you have in your book, The Full Story, that is that female sexuality is really the seat of every woman's power. Mm-hmm. And, it's such a beautiful way of putting it. But, ultimately you're talking about this idea of female empowerment. And I think it's one of these trendy words that is thrown around a lot. Sometimes in a good way. I don't want it to seem like that's not necessarily positive. However, I think what's happened is because it's being used so much nowadays, there's this sense of elusiveness, like no one really knows, what does that really mean? I know I come across that when I have conversations about, pole dancing or any other type of sensual activity. We're like, oh yes, the female empowerment thing. And it's sort of sometimes shrugged off. Sometimes it's like, ooh, female empowerment. And you're still like, what are we really saying here?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, and I feel like you talk about this a little bit too, is different people will then project different meanings onto what that means. And so for some, it's this idea of like, oh, the really sex-positive slut, and for others it's like, oh, she's just pretending she's got this power by, using sex in one way or another, using her femininity in one way or another. So I was just curious, what do you think, like who do you think is the empowered woman, and what are the traits that she has?
I think it's very different for every woman, actually. I think that, and I'm not backtracking on anything I've said, but I think my stance is softened somewhat in that I believe that female sexuality is the seat of every woman's power. I think the way in which they engage with that can be very different. And I think what that means to women is very different because women have different interpretations and understandings of their sexuality. So, for you and I, there's a kind of a joy in sharing it and exploring it and like getting down into it and talking about it. For other women, the joy is in keeping it extremely private, And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It depends on what your desire is. But speaking of desire, where I start to sort of question or, kind of dive into what it is that you want is how in touch are we with our desires. And so when you talk about empowerment, right, empowerment on some level is knowing what you want and what you don't want. It's being able to make choices that are in touch with your values and with your and sensations even. So particularly in terms of sex, which is primarily experienced in the body, being sexually empowered to me is always connected on some level to body and sensation, if that makes sense. Yeah. So the empowered woman to me would be someone who's in tune enough with her intuition, with her sensing self, with her body, to know what she wants and doesn't want, to know what desire feels like to her, and to be able to stand in that truth and share it with the world. That's to me what an empowered woman is.
Yeah. That's a really great way to put it, and I think it's so fascinating because I guess to understand what it's like to be empowered, you need to have been in the place where you're not empowered.
Yeah.
So I guess I think maybe, just thinking about this, delving into what it is that makes a lot of us still feel like we don't have that power. Is it because we're just not in touch with our desires, or is it, what do you think is really the root of that?
Well, I mean, speaking quite candidly from a very recent place of feeling disempowered from a breakup, I think part of what leads you to that place of disempowerment is overriding internal sensations and flags. On some level, not listening or not paying attention. We can leave it at that. And that manifests itself in different ways. So you will see women, when we take it back to sex, you will see women who will put everything out there, but they're doing it maybe from a disempowered place, right? They're sharing from a place of fear. They're sharing from a place of needing attention, of not, it's not a fullness from within. It's a like, I need this, because I don't feel full or because I don't feel good. And with other women, you'll see that they feel very full sexually, and maybe they choose to just cloak that off, because that's what they want, or they choose to only show a piece of it, It depends. So I think what ends up getting you cut off is not being in touch quite or always tracking. And I don't think it's a linear path. Like, I think we have moments where we feel more empowered and less empowered, and I think we go through phases where we feel better and we feel worse. And I think it's not like, okay, it goes maybe even like this, like a spiral. So I don't think it's a permanent destination in a way. I think it's a goal, but I think you end up moving in and out of it as you learn and go through experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I love the analogy of this, because that is really, yeah.
You're like, why am I here again? Oh, wait, I'm not. I was down there.
Yeah, this is like, it still feels like you're going up, so there's still a positive.
Yeah.
And I like that it's a swirl, which is very
totally.
That roundness.
Yeah.
But I think it is, what you're saying is great, because there is a lot of confusion in this day and age, because we have things like pole dancing classes and other versions of activities and things out there that we feel are connected to female empowerment, that there's nearly like a negative, there's a bad rep that's being created, I think, or a huge confusion and misconception on this idea of, like, the women who are just like sex crazed, like lunatics running around,
the problem
in stripper shoes, God forbid.
No, the problem is that what's happening and what people can't quite wrap their head around is those traditional markers of objectifying a woman, right? Of what we used to think of as that woman is just being a slut, quite frankly, or she's really just turning herself into an object, are now kind of being I forget what the word is, kind of reabsorbed by women and turned into a tool for their own pleasure. Now, some people buy that argument and some people don't. But the idea, I think, that a woman could get pleasure out of being overtly sexual is still something we struggle with, because at the end of the day, like, I think the archetype of the unrepenting whore is something that the United States can never forgive. I think that's the idea that you're a woman who openly enjoys sex and being sexual is somewhat unforgivable in our culture. And until we move past that and accept that you can be that way and be a good mother and be a faithful wife if you need to be, and whatever, that it's not the mark of the devil, so to speak, we won't go very far. So I think that people struggle with the idea that, and I think pleasing a man has also become demonized. So the idea that you would want to, do this for a man is mind-boggling to a lot of women, and that is something people have to get past too, because there's nothing wrong with wanting to give a man pleasure. It's actually really good and healthy.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I think it is interesting, because, again, there's these, I was about to say blurred lines, and then I was about to talk about Miley Cyrus, and it totally was like an accident in my head. But I was going to say there are these blurred lines between a woman that is really whole and authentic in her sexuality, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're running around in like the tiniest skirt. It could for some people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're the stereotype of running around in this tiny little skirt and like, rubbing your ass against everything. It's more this. It's a much deeper sense of power where you're getting in touch with the feminine genius, which we can get into in a little bit, but and sort of intuition and all of these naturally, like what used to be really highly revered feminine values, but in this context of very masculine, patriarchy. But instead, like what we see is, and I'm going to use Miley Cyrus as an example because I feel like that was just something that recently popped in my head is, there was all this discussion back and forth. Oh, is this right? Is it not? Leave the girl alone. Don't leave her alone. She's doing. And, I feel for me, ultimately, what I felt, my reaction was, I did feel a sense of, I think it was awkwardness more than shock, really, when I was watching her performance at the VMAs. And it was not because, and I questioned it because I thought, okay, what am I judging here? Right. And where's this coming from?
Yeah.
And for me, ultimately, I was like, I don't have a problem. Like, I've taken a booty popping class. Like, I'm all for, like, doing whatever. Yeah. The girl is her own person. She can do whatever the hell she wants. Worse things have happened on stage. Like, I couldn't quite put my finger on it for a while until I realized that it was a lack of authenticity, in my opinion. So I think that there are other pop singers out there who've done some interesting, controversial things that I still feel it came from some sort of genuine place. Yeah. Whereas with her, it really felt, when it was just an instinct, I don't know, watching it, consuming that whole behavior felt to me like it was very forced, and it was like she felt she needed to do that. Yeah. Which is similar to when you sometimes go out and, you see someone doing like a woman who's out there and like out of control, right. And you feel bad because it's not actually, it's coming from a place of needing attention, like you said earlier, and it's actually a place of disempowerment as opposed to empowerment. So I think that's where a lot of people get confused. They automatically think, oh, well, now everyone's pole dancing and booty popping, and it's just a mess.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, that was my exact reaction, too, to Miley Cyrus, was like, why am I being judgy? Like, I'm being judgy. Why? And the same thing, I was like, because it's not authentic. Because it's not, you can see in the way that she's doing it and moving her body that it's a charade, that it's not deeply rooted into some kind of, I don't know, internal knowing. It's just not rooted in anything. And I think you see that even sometimes in dancers and pole dancers, that they're telling a different story sometimes with their bodies, but that it's not rooted. It's not, it's not anchored in anything. You're playing at something. And there's a difference between being authentically sexy and playing at it, which I think is what we're kind of touching on, right?
Yeah, and I think that actually maybe we can talk a little bit to, I guess, the method that S Factor uses when it comes to this whole feeling and being sexy in your body as opposed to, playing sexy, this whole presentational versus authentic. How do you think, I guess now with all that, I'm thinking a lot about like teenage girls right now, growing up and, continuing to see things like Miley Cyrus on TV or whatever, and feeling like, oh, that's what I need to do in order to be perceived as sexy. What do you think is something that we need to do, I guess, as maybe older women or as mentors in order to help guide younger souls, younger women to a place of empowerment quicker so that they're able to make all these decisions from a really genuine feminine place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first of all, we have to approach the way we talk about and teach sex to young women differently. In other words, it can't be talked about just in clinical terms, like put a condom on, don't. I think we should be teaching young people about pleasure too, you know? I mean, here's your clitoris, here's what it does, here's how to find out about what it doesn't, you know, what pleasures you and doesn't. I think that if we continue to kind of teach it or put sex for girls in a sort of a like, well, if you do it, it's a big deal kind of a light, you know, or if you do it, you know, there are consequences. It's always like with this risk, you know. I was always raised in the idea that there was risk involved in sex, you know, if you're a girl. Not if you're a boy, if you're a girl, you know. I guess the risk of pregnancy is legitimate. And I think, number one, we have to start with kind of removing that attitude or tone so young women aren't as fearful of it and they feel like it's a little bit more of a healthy, natural thing to engage in. And then secondly, I think we really have to, and this is where maybe some of what S Factor teaches comes in, is start to teach them how to get in touch, and I said this earlier, with what pleasure feels like. Because young women often, and older women too, misinterpret desire as, does he want me? Does he want me? Well, then I want him, you know, or that's desire for them, is being desired. And, you know, that's not something that's coming from within at all. So if we can begin to teach how to be aware of those signals of desire in the body, to kind of know what that feeling is and pay attention, close attention to that, you know, tied in with that intuition piece, tied in with that wisdom piece, then I think that young girls will begin to know, hey, this is for me, this is not for me, and they can make choices. We do that by trial and error anyway, you know, as part of growing up. But I think if we had a little more guidance, there would be less suffering.
Yeah, what you say is definitely, I think it's all connected to, and it's starting, the more I think about this and read about this topic, the more I feel like there's these 4 words that keep popping up for me that I think all have, like, I nearly feel like I want to make a diagram, which is, you know, knowledge and power, which I think are key, like going back to our whole topic about sex is power, you know, they say knowledge is power, and then we've got desire and shame. And I think that those 4, there's all these different ways that you can go about connecting these 4 ideas, but ultimately it is because I think men, and I don't want to say men like as individuals, but I think just overall like patriarchy as a system and the different institutions out there that represent those values, different religions, the media, et cetera, like there's always been such fear of women's sexuality because of the immense power in that, right? So anything from like a woman's gaze, her skin showing, her intuitive abilities, and all that, the nurturing and connection to the earth that comes with all of that. So all those things led to such a deep-rooted fear of female sexuality that then, in turn, so all these things that came up and started to suppress and silence our femininity and our sexuality really led to this inevitable like cloak of shame that we wear on us always. And I think desire is sort of that the answer to reversing that whole thing, so that, you know, once women really are aware of their deepest, like you say, their deepest longings, their true desires, they're then able to negate and strip off, no pun intended, shame, in order to go back to that place of knowledge, which then leads to power. So it's sort of like really going back. I'm going to make a diagram.
Make a diagram. I love it. Yeah.
But yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot more work that maybe it's just because I've recently, I don't know if you know the work of Brené Brown. So she's great. She talks about the power of vulnerability, and shame is like a huge topic that she goes into, and it's connected to everything, but I think specifically what we're talking about is it's so key, because the reason why we don't have the power that we could have is because it's shame that's really stopping us, you know, and that shame can come in so many different forms, whether it is through religion or social norms, or you know, a specific family member that maybe made you feel like, oh, you can't do this, that, things like that. And there's this, we need to really work on reversing that. And so I know that you and I are both pole dancers. We've both done S Factor, and I'm sure I've looked into other venues and other ways in which to continue to unleash all that inner bombshell or whatever you want to call it. But what do you think, is there anything else out there? Like, what if people aren't really into the whole pole? Because it's not for everyone, right?
It's for everyone, no.
So I know your focus tends to be on erotic dance, but do you, like, coming across your work, like, do you feel like there was anything else that, like, where else do women go to find that deep longing and desire?
I think that it can be done in a number of different venues. I would make the argument, but I don't have the research, but I would make the argument that any kind of mind-body practice, not even one that's necessarily oriented around sex, can help you to become aware of what you want and don't want and lead you to better intuition. Yoga, meditation. I can't think of any others besides that today, but there's a number of practices that can then help you to open up to that. Even massage, to some extent. Getting regular massage changes people. It changes their awareness of their body. It changes their comfort levels. So, I think when you begin to focus that movement around sexuality, things happen faster and more explosively. Because in terms of change, because you're honing in on what it is that you want to shift, and there's, so it happens more quickly. But I think it can happen through other avenues, for sure. I also want to go back to something you said about the shame, because, and this kind of sexuality being the seat of female power. One of the things, there's a really good book called Misogyny by this guy, Jack Holland, and he kind of goes through and documents, like, the history of misogyny around the world. And what he finishes with is really fascinating. He basically says most of misogyny stems from men's inability to relate healthily to female sexuality and to be able to relate well to women as mothers and as sexual creatures. They can't, and there's a great deal of fear around what that body can do, how much power it has, because it does arouse men a lot of the times. Now, people will make the argument, oh, well, we're humans, we're this, we're that, we should be able to control it, and we can, obviously, but there's still, that doesn't take away the power. And he basically said the solution is not to jettison all of that, the female power, the female sexuality. It's beginning to celebrate it as something as valuable as male power.
That's great. I want to read that book now.
Yeah,
I guess that totally brings me to my next question, which was going to be like the role of men in all of this, because it's a hard time for guys now too, because it's confusing. We're in this world where the masculine and feminine is shifting, and no one knows what's going on, and everyone's having trouble dating because you've got all these women who grew up in this world where they feel like they need to take on, certain masculine qualities in order to get where they need to get in their career, and everyone has to have a career nowadays because you got to make money, because it's not enough to just have one person making money. So I feel like all of this is it's just causing so much stress and putting a lot of pressure on really several different generations. And I look around and I just see everyone's confused. Like, what do I do? There's all these empowered women, and I don't know, what do I do with them? Open the door, do I not open the door?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I have I guess I'm just like throwing out an idea. I'm not sure I have a specific question, but I'm more, just because it plays in my head too a lot, like how do we create a space for men to become comfortable with this idea of merging, I guess, the Virgin Mary and the Mary Magdalene archetype, if we want to use that as an example, in the one modern, like, woman that this person is trying to date.
That's, wow. Well, I don't know.
I
I'm not an expert on men by a long shot. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on women either. But one thing I do think is true that's an unfortunate byproduct of some of the kind of wonderful things that women have gained in terms of equality is that you kind of end up having this neutralization, right? There's less polarization between the masculine and the feminine, and that can affect attraction to a certain degree. Of course, how you are attracted to someone varies from person to person, but I think, coming back to your question, I think for men to be able to accept it, women have to accept it first. In other words, it has to start with women being comfortable with both of those sides of themselves and holding both as equally true and a part of who they are, right? And then I think as more women kind of do that, it will ideally force a shift in the perception of what it means, to be Mary Magdalene and the Madonna in the same person. In other words, that split won't exist. I think men too. I don't know. I think men are ultimately, really good. I love men. I think they're really wonderful. I think they're great, and I don't, I think part of it too is that women need to begin to stop bashing men as much. We are all guilty of it. I'm certainly, do it as well. But I think when there's a safer space for that dialogue to start to happen, it'll be better. But I also think that men need to look at how their own desires function and what they want and don't want, and be able to kind of accept both sides of a woman. Not really saying a whole lot right now, but
I'm like right there. I'm in it. I'm like, yeah, I get it.
It's hard. I don't know what the answer is. I think to some extent it's very hard for men.
It is. I nearly feel. I feel. I have a lot of empathy for what's going on with them because I think it's 10 times harder than what's happening with us. Because at least with us, we sort of have an idea of what's going on inside of us and amongst our communities, I guess. With them, they're just sort of like, oh, is this happening now? Okay.
Yeah, one other thought I had is, and this is a recent kind of thing I've been thinking over, I think that men, as much as they love sex and they love sexy women and they love sexuality, I think when they claim you, when they want you to be theirs, they don't want to see as much of you like putting it out there. In other words, they're sensitive to your fidelity. They're sensitive to your, what they've kind of decided they want to invest in. And I'm not saying that should become a controlling issue or that they should be restricting in any way. But I think maybe some of that fear, right, comes from a fear of infidelity, comes from a fear of, well, what is she going to do with that? Maybe it's not even directly just between man and woman, but also other men, that kind of a thing. I would imagine that getting around that would be part of that feeling of that split.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the immense power of like authentic feminine sexuality and really being there in your body and really glowing and exuding all of that is going to be scary for anyone. And so there is an instinct because of so many years of doing that. There will be an instinct even in the individual men who may have really good intentions to try to curb that again for their own sake. And it's coming from a good place. And I think, it may have been coming from a good place all these years. I'm not necessarily saying that.
I don't even know if it still comes from a good place. I'm just saying it exists. And I'm suggesting that men also have to be cognizant of that, That's what I think.
That what? Sorry,
But men have to be also cognizant of their own fears around female sexuality. In other words, the inability to integrate those two on some level may also have to do with their own fears around what it means to have someone who is, attractive or radiating a kind of sexuality, and that, it feeds back to the idea that women are property, or they're this or they're that, and that's not something we really want to go back to.
Yeah. I think, I've been thinking also about, like, on a practical level, it's like this is all, like, I come from a sociology background, so I like to talk in, like, these wide spectrum, like, theories, I guess, and probably for you it's sort of similar, but I think in a practical sense, like, I'm just thinking about an example, like, there's still this issue of that when many women face, and I can say I'm definitely one of them, where, you go, let's say you meet a man, and there's this whole, like, which game do I play? Like, which strategy am I going to use now? And, obviously the ultimate goal is to not use any strategy and to be your authentic self, but, you still have these moments where you feel, and I know that for me, I end up feeling like I may need a strategy because it's so scary to be your authentic self, because they can't accept that you may be both, that you are integrated. So I always find there's this, like, crossroad that I have to, like, I reach a crossroad very early on when I meet someone where I go, like, oh, am I going to be myself, or am I just going to, have fun and, enjoy the physical aspect, but know that if I go that route, that chances are I'm going to have less respect from this person, or do I withhold? And again, this goes back to the sexist power, because I actually directed a film called Hannah Has a Hoe Face.
Yes, I still want to see that.
Sorry?
I want to see that.
Oh, you should. It's on Hulu for free.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, then I'll watch it. Yeah. Good.
And it's I bring that up only because there are two main characters in this film are both, they're polar opposites, and they're best friends and roommates, and one of them is sort of what's stereotypically more of a prude, and the other one is stereotypically a slut, or what people would call that. And, they both ultimately, what I learned over the years of developing the script was, like, they ultimately really want the same thing, which is power or control over the opposite sex. And they're doing it in exactly opposite ways. So one girl's like, I'm going to give you my body, and I am, I'm going to take, like, there's a power in that, and being like, I'm going to fuck you before you fuck me emotionally. And I'm okay with that. And then, the other girl that's like, I'm going to hold back the one thing I have, so that you are in the palm of my hand until I really, really, like, that's it. Like, I can't hold back anymore. And it's just interesting because you continue to meet people in this day and age who feel one way or the other, and I find myself, like, oscillating back and forth between, oh, well, maybe this is going to work for this person, or this will work, and, like, and throughout the years also, like, trying different things, and I don't know, I don't really have an answer yet as to what works. I mean, obviously for me, the ideal version is that I meet someone who just is okay with whatever I decide to do that day because it feels right. But it's still something that's really hard for women, and I don't know I guess I don't know what I'm saying. I guess it's just one of those things that comes up a lot, and it's hard because I think it's a symptom of the fact that we're in this transitional period where you still come across men who do have these ideas of, oh my God, she slept with me the first night, so there's no way this girl could ever be my wife.
Right. And oh my gosh, this girl's a pole dancer. I think that's becoming more widely accepted, but even 5 years ago, it's like if you led the conversation with that, people were like, I'm sorry, you do what? It's so there's something about that that's alternately thrilling and intoxicating, and girls love it too, and dangerous kind of. And then there's something that's also really like, oh, I would never do that. I couldn't. I don't. It's just not for me. And maybe sometimes it isn't, but there's a kind of a stigma around it. So I think you're right when you talk about who do you present. You're talking about a symptom of the transition that we're in, and women maybe not quite being at the point where they can fully show all of those sides without being a little bit judged for it, or a little bit like, stigmatized for it. You know, it's like, well, and again, people confuse it with like, you know, a showy need for attention sometimes versus, you know, oh, well, what is she, you know, versus a part of who you are, you know. I mean, I think, in generally speaking, it's easy to intuitively sense the difference between that, but we have such an ingrained understanding of what it, you know, public displays of female sexuality mean, and they mean one thing, which is that you're a slut, that changing that is going to take some time. And in the meantime, it's very confusing for men and women to understand how to share those sides of themselves and understand that about one another. You know, that just because I like to take a dance class where I learn to dance like a stripper and I wear 8-inch heels and I, you know, touch my vagina sometimes in my dance class, you know, because that's what we do sometimes, doesn't mean that I'm a whore, you know. It doesn't mean that I'm a loose woman. It doesn't mean I sleep around, or maybe I do, you know, whatever. It doesn't, that you can't attach things to that. It's an expression. It's a bodily expression of a certain way of feeling and being. Mm-hmm. It's fun to explore, and it's important to explore. Yeah. And I think that people cannot wrap their minds around that. They're like, why are you doing it? You know, like, try it. You'll see.
Seriously, guys, try it. No, you make a very good point, and I think that ultimately, I'm just thinking about going back to the whole power thing also. There's so, you know, power in and of itself is like something you have that you can use positively or negatively too, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we've got this history where I guess the powerful, I don't know, I want to call it the forces of power, I don't know what, the people on top, right, and the different institutions that had the power were sort of there suppressing our sexuality, yet we now have this, like, we figured out what it is that we need to do, which is really get in touch with our deepest desires and our true feminine essence, to regain that power. But then that power, you know, again, is something that we need to make sure that we use responsibly. So also doing that is, part of that is allowing, like, giving men the space to also be there, and to do what they need to do and feel comfortable in their masculine and do all of that. I mean, I'm getting more, like, recently I feel like there's been all this, I don't know, I feel like I've watched a documentary on it. I went to this event last week where we were talking a lot about masculine and feminine, how it relates to the, you know, the values, and how it relates to the dating world nowadays and why everyone's confused. But that ultimately you can look at it in both ways. You can take it as something really positive and something really negative, and there's still, I think, a lot of people out there who aren't necessarily seeing the positive side of things, and that it's not this, like, rampant crazy party. Yeah.
I like what you say about using the power responsibly, because that's another piece that's not taught to young women, or to women in general, or it's actually taught that you should use it to exploit. In other words, use it to your benefit. Yeah. That's problematic, you know? I mean, that creates a lot of issues in terms of safety and trust between men and women. And it's also not healthy, because you're basically, you know, exploiting something. You're exploiting people when you do that. You know, when you use your power in ways it's not healthy or helpful, it's bad news. Yeah. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, there's this book called Erotic Capital that I read, and I liked it for a lot of reasons. But this woman basically, she's British. She basically makes the argument that you should just use your sexuality across the board to get what you want in the world, because it's capital, the same way that money is capital, the same way that knowledge is capital. It is a tool that women have, and we should be using it in all arenas. And here's actually why it's a good thing. Some of what she says makes sense, but the piece that she leaves out is intimacy. And it's like, okay, well, no, that's a great argument, but when you're constantly angering, where you're constantly playing a game, or you're using power like that in an intimate relationship, you're losing. I mean, there's no intimacy when there's power struggles. So again, it's like the use of responsible power. And in intimate relationships, that's a very touchy subject, and sex, female sexuality, can be misused quite a bit.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I guess what I would add on to that is I do think that if you are in a genuine, healthy relationship where both people are fully, authentically in themselves and accepting each other 100%, that isn't even like that dynamic doesn't, or that space doesn't even allow for a dynamic like that. Because, well, one, you wouldn't want to do it as a woman, I would hope.
No.
But two, there's nothing that, I guess what I don't know if I should call it manipulation, but what sounds like what she's saying to a certain extent is, using that insane amount of power that you do have in your female sexuality to get whatever you need to get, and some of that may be manipulative of sorts. I feel like that comes from a place of still fear, right? So,
because there's no openness, there's no vulnerability in that.
Yeah. Whereas if your partner knows and accepts you 100% in all your forms, with all your idiosyncratic layers and all of that, then there wouldn't ever be fear in them, and therefore you wouldn't have the manipulative power to use your sexuality
to get what you
want. In any.
Yeah, and she used the way she describes it in relationships. She describes it in the boardroom, and she describes it in all these different scenarios. And in relationships, she makes this comparison between a couple that splits everything 50-50, that they both work, they both do this. So in other words, a couple where there's no masculine, feminine polarization, right? And then a couple where the woman stays at home, but she basically is fully taken care of. It's so traditional in a way. It's so funny that but that she is actually more empowered because she is really sitting in the feminine seat of, having the sexiness, having the sexuality, having the this to get what she wants. And to me, that's manipulative. To me, that's a very shallow representation of what relationships could be. But she talks about certain things that do make sense. But again, I think that comes in under the category overall, the misuse of female sexuality and power. And you're right. I love that you said that if ultimately two people fully accept each other for who they are, then there is no need to manipulate. There's no fear. There is no need to tamp another person down or to draw them in a certain way.
Well, let's all aspire to that.
Yes.
I think we should end on that good note because it's
okay. Good.
I think we painted this really ideal picture of this beautiful couple that I really want to be.
Yeah, me too.
And I think we're getting there. I mean, I just sort of want to, in wrapping it up, I think that there's a huge shift going on in the values in the world now, and there's talk about all that, the feminine rising, and just overall shifting from a more capitalistic, patriarchal, individualistic world to a place where we're like, oh shit, the environment's going to shit, we're killing the earth, what's happening? We need to all work together as a community, which, I think is a very feminine value. So I think in that shift, which may take longer than our lifetime, unfortunately, but during these years, I think what's happening is definitely positive, and it's just that we're all we're sort of going oh, what's happening here? And we're it's like a dance, a dance through the transition. And I think what you said about the male bashing thing is quite important too. Is that lots of times it's very easy for us, and I'm the first to admit it. Oh my God, I can't take this anymore. There's no good guys out there, and it's all shit show, and all of that. And I think that that just perpetuates the insecurity in men, which then perpetuates their need to feel like they need to take a hold of, or I guess keep under wraps our true being. And so it just works against us to do that. So I like that you said that as well. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, but I think this is
No, I think that was perfect ending, and thank you.
Yeah. Did you end up? Does your window come up big, or is that still not?
No. I wonder how. Yeah, no.
I hope that in the actual recording it'll work out okay, but we'll see.
We'll find out.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm so
Yeah.
glad we got a chance to chat, and yeah, hopefully we'll talk more soon.
I hope so.
All right. Well, have a great rest of the night
You too.
and weekend, and thanks again.
Okay, bye.
Bye.